You open your phone to check one message, and 40 minutes later, you're studying a stranger's kitchen renovation, wondering why yours still looks the same as it did 10 years ago. You see a coworker's promotion post and your stomach tightens before you've even finished reading the caption. An old classmate's vacation photos land in your feed, and something in you goes quiet and a little mean. You catch yourself doing math you never agreed to do, their salary against yours, their body against yours, the life you haven't built yet against the one you actually have. You tell yourself it doesn't matter. You check again in an hour anyway. Why does someone else's good news land in your body like bad news? Why can't you just look away? Most people explain this to themselves as a personal flaw, insecurity, vanity, a streak of envy to be ashamed of and manage quietly. Alone, that explanation is comfortable, and it is wrong, and it has kept people stuck for decades. In 1954, a psychologist named Leon Festinger proposed something very different. Comparison, he argued, isn't a character defect. It's a built-in drive, as automatic and involuntary as hunger. Your mind runs this program constantly, whether you invite it to or not, in the background of nearly every social moment you move through, usually without your awareness that it's even running. This video walks through what Festinger discovered, why the comparing never fully stops, and what to do with the drive once you understand it's not the enemy you thought it was. Festinger's starting point was almost embarrassingly simple. Human beings, he said, need to know where they stand. Not want, need. There exists, in the human organism, a drive to evaluate his opinions and abilities, he wrote, and he meant it literally, as a psychological hunger with the same urgency as a physical one. You don't decide to want to know if you're doing well. You just do. It's baked into how you're built. Here's the part most people miss. Festinger's theory wasn't really about vanity or ego. It was about uncertainty. He found that people reach for comparison most intensely in exactly the moments they have no objective way to measure themselves, no ruler, no score, no external fact to consult. Am I a good parent? Am I behind in my career? Am I attractive? There's no tape measure for any of it. So your mind does the next best thing. It looks sideways at another person, and uses them as the measuring stick you don't otherwise have. Notice how differently this plays out when an objective standard does exist. A runner doesn't agonize over whether she's fast, the stopwatch tells her, flatly, without any need for another body in the race. But take away the stopwatch. Ask her instead whether she's a good enough friend, a good enough daughter, sufficiently on track for someone her age, and the anxious searching starts immediately, because now there's nothing to consult except other people. Festinger's insight was that comparison isn't the disease, it's the fallback your mind reaches for whenever certainty runs out, which, in most of modern life, is often. Picture two co-workers walking out of the same performance review. Both told they're meeting expectations. One goes home relieved. The other goes home gutted because she'd already clocked that a peer on her team got exceeding expectations last quarter, and now meeting feels like falling behind. Same words, same room. Two completely different emotional outcomes, and the difference has nothing to do with the review itself. It's entirely about who each woman used as her reference point. You may recognize yourself in that gap, the feeling of doing objectively fine and still feeling behind, simply because your mind quietly selected someone specific to measure yourself against, often without your permission. This is the first thing to understand. The comparing isn't optional. And it isn't proof that something is wrong with you. It's your mind trying to answer a question it's wired to ask. The trouble starts with what happens next, who you pick, and what you do with the answer. Festinger identified 2 directions this drive can run, and almost everyone lives somewhere on the line between them without realizing it. The first is upward comparison, measuring yourself against someone who seems to be doing better. Done well, this can function almost like fuel. You watch someone run a faster mile than you and think, so it's possible, and that thought pulls you toward the track. But upward comparison has a second, darker mode. Instead of pulling you forward, it can flatten you in place. The gap between you and the other person stops looking like a path and starts looking like a verdict. The second direction is downward comparison, measuring yourself against someone who seems to be struggling more than you. This one gets a bad reputation, but it exists for a reason. When people are frightened or in pain, they instinctively look for someone worse off, and it genuinely soothes them. Researchers who built on Festinger's original work later found this pattern especially strongly in people recovering from illness or lost patients coping with a diagnosis, often felt calmer after talking to someone facing a harder version of the same diagnosis. Not because they wished harm on anyone, but because the contrast gave their nervous system a moment of relief. The danger is when it becomes the only strategy when feeling okay depends on constantly finding someone beneath you, which is a fragile, exhausting way to hold your own worth, because it requires a steady supply of other people's suffering just to keep functioning. Consider 2 people who both just went through a difficult breakup. One spends the evening scrolling through an ex's new relationship, upward comparison in its rawest form, and ends the night convinced she's unlovable. The other spends the evening talking to a friend going through something worse, downward comparison in its rawest form, and ends the night telling herself, "At least I'm not that bad off," without ever actually processing her own grief. Neither one is dealing with the breakup. Both are using another person as a mirror instead of looking directly at themselves. You've probably done both, reached up for a person's life you're now measuring yourself against, and reached down to feel better by contrast, sometimes within the same afternoon. Neither direction, on its own, tells you who you are. It only tells you where you're currently standing in relation to someone else, which is a very different thing, and mistaking the second for the first is where most of the damage happens. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. Here is where the story turns. Because Festinger did his research decades before anyone carried a screen in their pocket that showed them thousands of curated lives a day. He was describing a mechanism built for occasional, local comparison, your neighbor, your classmate, the handful of people in your actual physical world. He was not describing what happens when that same ancient mechanism gets fed a non-stop stream of strangers' highlight reels. This is the asymmetry that makes modern comparison so corrosive. What you compare is your unfiltered backstage life, the argument you just had, the body you see in bad lighting, the anxious 2 a.m. thoughts against everyone else's filtered, front stage life, the vacation, the achievement, the flattering angle. You are never comparing like against like. You are comparing your footage to their trailer. Nobody posts the argument in the parking lot before the anniversary dinner. Nobody posts the 14 unflattering photos deleted before the one that got kept. You know this intellectually, and it changes almost nothing in the moment. Because the drive Festinger described doesn't pause to fact-check its inputs. It just takes whatever it's shown and produces a standing, a rank, a verdict instantly. automatically, whether or not the material was ever a fair sample in the first place. Think about scrolling in bed at night. You're tired, your defenses are down, and in 10 minutes you pass a friend's engagement, a stranger's six-pack, a former classmate's job title. Festinger's drive to evaluate fires every single time, dozens of times. Each one asking the same silent question, where do I stand? And each one getting answered with incomplete, curated data that was never designed to give you an honest picture. Now compare that to a woman a generation or two ago, standing in her actual kitchen, aware of maybe a dozen households in any real detail, her sisters, her neighbors, her co-workers. Her comparison drive fired occasionally, against people she could contextualize, whose full lives she had some real access to. She knew her neighbor's marriage had rough patches, because she'd heard the arguments through the wall. You don't get the wall. You get the wedding photo. The mechanism inside you is running the exact same ancient software as hers, but hers was fed a handful of complete stories, and yours is fed thousands of fragments, stripped of context, optimized for the single moment that looks best. You may recognize this specific exhaustion, not sadness exactly, more like a low static hum of not enough that follows you out of the app and into the rest of your evening, without ever pointing to one clear cause. That hum is the drive Festinger described, firing over and over against information it was never built to process. It's worth stopping here to say plainly what this whole mechanism actually is, because the reframe matters. What you're dealing with isn't a personality flaw you need to confess and correct. It's an adaptation, a survival strategy your mind developed, because, for almost all of human history, knowing your standing relative to the group wasn't vanity. It was safety information. Who has more resources? Who has more standing? Who's thriving and who's struggling in a small tribe? That knowledge shaped whether you ate, who protected you, who you could rely on when things went wrong. Falling out of step with the group wasn't a minor social embarrassment back then. It could mean losing access to food, to protection, to the people you depended on to survive a hard winter. The drive to evaluate kept people oriented inside their social world because, for most of human history, staying oriented was the difference between safety and real danger. Your mind hasn't caught up to the fact that the group is no longer 40 people you actually know. It's now, potentially, millions of strangers algorithmically selected to be more impressive than average. Because impressive content is what keeps you scrolling. You are running an ancient, sensible program on data it was never designed to handle. That's not weakness. That's a mismatch between old wiring and a new environment. Think of someone who grew up terrified of scarcity, always finishing every meal on their plate, even after the scarcity ended. Because the part of them that formed that habit never got the memo that things had changed. Your comparison drive is doing something similar. It formed to keep a small, known tribe oriented. Nobody sent it the memo that the tribe is now the entire internet, refreshed every few seconds, forever. It's still doing its job. The job just stopped making sense at this scale. This reframe changes what you're allowed to feel about it. You don't need to eliminate a flaw. You need to notice when a genuinely useful drive is being triggered by information that can't actually tell you anything true about your own life. There's a real difference between a smoke alarm going off because of a fire and one going off because you burned toast. The alarm isn't broken in either case. It's doing exactly what it was built to do. The question isn't how to silence the alarm. It's learning to tell, quickly, which situation, you're actually in. Which brings up an important question worth sitting with for a moment. What is the comparing actually trying to protect underneath all the noise? Here's the reframe that changes how the whole mechanism feels from the inside. Comparison, at its root, isn't asking, am I better or worse than this person? That's the surface question, the one that stings. Underneath it is a quieter, more useful question. What do I actually want? And how far am I from it? Festinger's later work on the topic pointed towards something researchers now call similarity and relevance. People don't compare randomly. You don't feel a thing when a professional athlete outruns you, because the comparison feels irrelevant, no threat to your self-concept. But you feel a great deal when a peer, someone your age, in your field, on a path you recognize as close to yours, pulls ahead. The sting is proportional to relevance. And relevance is information. It tells you, with more precision than almost anything else, what you actually care about. Think of two friends who each notice the same acquaintance just published a book. One feels nothing writing was never her thing, so the fact rolls right past her, filed alongside all the other things she doesn't measure herself by. The other feels a jolt of something sharp and uncomfortable, because some part of her has wanted to write for years and never started. Same fact, wildly different reaction, and the reaction is the useful part. It's a signal flare pointing directly at a desire she hadn't fully admitted to herself, possibly one she'd have kept avoiding indefinitely if the comparison hadn't forced it into view. This is why trying to simply suppress comparison, to white-knuckle your way past every twinge of it, wastes the most useful part of the mechanism. The twinge is doing something a straightforward inventory of your goals often can't. It's bypassing the polite, curated answer you'd give if someone asked what you want, and going straight to the raw, involuntary one. Nobody plans to feel a stab of longing at a friend's new relationship. That's exactly what makes it trustworthy data. You may recognize this in your own sharpest comparisons. The ones that actually hurt are rarely random. They cluster around exactly the areas of your life you already feel unfinished in. That's not a coincidence. That's the drive doing its real job, if you're willing to read it correctly instead of just flinching from it. So what do you actually do with a mechanism you can't switch off? You stop trying to eliminate the comparing, because that fight can't be won. It's not a bad habit sitting on top of you. It's the architecture underneath you. Instead, you change your relationship to what it's telling you. When the sting shows up, the useful move isn't stop feeling this. It's what is this pointing at? A flash of envy toward someone's calm. Steady relationship isn't proof you're broken. It's data about what you want more of. A flash of resentment toward a colleague's confidence in meetings is a signal flare, not a character indictment. The second shift is choosing your inputs the way you'd choose your food. Festinger's mechanism evaluates whatever you feed it, without judgment about whether the input is fair. A feed engineered to show you only peak moments from thousands of people will generate a distorted, punishing answer every time you consult it. Narrowing what you look at and who you measure yourself against isn't avoidance. It's giving an honest system, honest material to work with. And the third shift is remembering the difference between information and verdict. Where you stand relative to someone else at this one moment is a data point useful, sometimes even motivating. It was never meant to be read as a final ruling on your worth, and treating it as one is the part that actually causes the damage, not the comparing itself. Picture the difference between a compass and a courtroom. A compass just tells you a direction. It has no opinion about whether you're a good person for being off course. It simply points. and you adjust or you don't. A courtroom delivers a verdict, final and personal, something to accept and carry. Most people let every comparison walk straight into the courtroom. The retraining isn't about muting the signal. It's about meeting it at the compass instead, taking the direction, and leaving the verdict at the door. The drive that made you check your phone one more time tonight, that made your stomach tighten at someone else's good news, was never trying to hurt you. It was trying to orient you, to tell you where you stand, and quietly, underneath that, what you actually want. It has been running this way since long before you had a name for it, and it will keep running long after you stop fighting it. So the only real choice left is what you do with what it hands you. Stop asking it to stop. Start asking it what it's pointing at. That question, asked honestly every time the sting shows up, is the only one that was ever worth answering.